This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. If you're watching us as we're airing, we're delighted to be one of your last stops before you get started with your nighttime routine. Disregard if you're watching this any other time. Let's get into it, folks. We know at least two things for sure that make for better living conditions: clean air and access to clean water. But not everyone in the US has the luxury of choosing to live in safer and healthier areas. And in fact, many communities of color in particular are forced to deal with these kinds of environmental hazards, leading to negative health outcomes. The term for this is environmental racism. For example, a recent ProPublica analysis tracked hazardous air pollution across the country between 2014 and 2018 and found that in predominantly Black areas, the estimated cancer risk from toxic air pollution is more than double that of majority white areas. While some states had some policies in place to protect against this, many of them became outdated years ago. In Pennsylvania, their Department of Environmental Protection established an environmental justice policy in 2004, and they went almost 2 decades without updating it. Now it's being rewritten to ensure a more equitable environment for minority and low-income neighborhoods. Outdated plans are pretty common across the country, but recently, the state's Department of Environmental Protection decided to make some changes to make sure the policy meets the needs of Pennsylvania residents today. Justin Dula, director of their Office of Environmental Justice, chatted with us to provide more context on the updates.
We wanted to see where we might have opportunities to strengthen environmental justice in issues beyond the permitting process and beyond public participation. So we're looking at our climate change action plan, ways to prioritize environmental justice around grant programs that DEP administers, looking at where we might have authority to consider environmental justice in enforcement, compliance, and inspection efforts that we do.
Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf signed an executive order in the fall of 2021 saying that the state must uphold the Environmental Rights Amendment, which says people have the right to clean air and water, and that all Pennsylvanians are entitled to fair and equitable treatment and meaningful involvement in decision-making that affects their environment. The executive order also made sure this is a group effort, with all state agencies working together through an Environmental Justice Interagency Council to look at ways they can all help beyond the Department of Environmental Protection. The department says they've been engaging in public participation. It's crucial to make sure that people impacted are part of these discussions. The policy improvements aim to tackle some of the biggest issues these low-income minority communities face.
In urban communities, a big issue that often comes up relates to illegal dumping on abandoned lots and sites. And so that's something that we hear a lot from urban communities. In rural communities, one example of an issue there relates to the historic legacy of anthracite coal mining, where those communities are experienced, the industry is gone, the mining industry is gone, but the environmental effects of those facilities are still there.
In California, environmental justice is becoming a part of city planning efforts. In 2018, it was the first state to pass a law requiring local governments to add an environmental justice element if they update 2 or more aspects of their city plans. And it's starting to take shape. This year, the Santa Ana City Council in Southern California voted to make updates to its nearly 40-year-old plan to address lead contamination and other land issues impacting low-income communities of color. Patricia Flores Irarrázaval is a Santa Ana resident who leads an environmental justice organization. Their group partnered with another local grassroots movement and through a study found that the highest levels of lead contamination were in migrant communities. They said it took mobilizing with other community members to get these changes approved, but that was all possible with the new law. Now, the city has committed to working on the issue.
We have blood lead testing for residents, as well as an assurance from the healthcare agency that all residents, regardless of immigration status, will be given access to healthcare for anything related to this lead impact crisis, right? They've agreed to jobs being prioritized for Santa Ana residents and to working with us in particular, OCEJ, to remediate across the city.
Patricia says if other states adopt a similar law, they could make it a little more specific.
Well, I think that SB 1000 was helpful in providing the context of you have a legal requirement to include an environmental justice component. There wasn't a lot of specific and binding language within the law already, and so we really had to push for that from our perspective.
Pennsylvania and California aren't alone in their efforts. In recent years, other states have introduced bills around environmental justice, created task forces, and made updates to existing policies. On the federal level, President Biden signed an executive order last year creating the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. The only way to truly measure these effects long term is to look at how these plans are enforced and data on health outcomes for minority communities down the road. To talk about this topic a bit more, we're bringing in Michael Mendes, urban planning and public policy professor at University of California, Irvine, who's here to talk with us about the connection between environmental justice and urban planning. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. We know that California is the first state to pass a law that incorporates environmental justice into city planning. How can this be a useful tool for combating injustice?
Thank you for having me here today and speaking about this important issue about how can we move forward environmental justice through urban planning. I'm an urban a planner by training. My research focuses on the intersection of climate change, public health, and environmental justice. And I view environmental justice primarily as an urban planning issue, specifically about how we plan our cities, what type of amenities we include, what type of noxious land uses, where we site them, are all components of how we plan our cities. And historically, we have planned our cities that in ways that disproportionately impact low-income communities and particularly communities of color, with overabundance of environmental hazards and disproportionate amount of noxious uses. SB 1000, which is a California bill, provides an excellent opportunity to require a city and counties in their general plans, which is the blueprint of how they envision the cities will look in 20, 30 years in terms of land uses, transportation, housing, to explicitly focus on environmental justice.
I'm curious to know, considering your expertise here, why do you think it's taken so long for a state to pass a law like this? And do you think other states will follow? Are other states, even introducing legislation like this?
I think California's prominence in this area as it rolls out of the law, it's going to create a lot of innovations. And the research that I've done talking to city planners, elected officials, and consultants that do some of this land use planning has told me that in more conservative suburban regions, these issues of environmental justice or equity in the land use planning process was never discussed. And now this law is, with an explicit focus on that, is forcing these hard discussions, which can be very hard for some of these communities to talk publicly and openly in a more deliberative manner of how urban planning and these land uses that elected officials are adopting and implementing are creating harms to some communities, particularly low-income communities of color.
I'm curious to know, what prompted movement on this? What was it that really kind of got the ball rolling on legislation like this?
Community groups here in California have been advocating for this linkage between public health, environmental health, and our land use process. Two localities that have strong environmental justice groups that either sued their local government over the siting of warehouses because of the increase in air pollution and other types of environmental burdens that they were going to experience. And they approached legislators in Sacramento to create a statewide mandate for this.
Clearly, we see that legislation is one path, but it's not the only way to address some of these issues. What else can be done to improve upon environmental justice on the state level?
Providing priority to these communities in terms of resources and funding can make all the difference and implement more sustainable land use projects, community-based projects that provide amenities such as green space, green infrastructure, cleaner air, and other co-benefits.
Michael Mendes is an urban planning and public policy professor at the University of California, Irvine, where he focuses on environmental justice and urban planning. Michael, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.